This is the story of the greatest fighting general of World War II, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, and of the small group of brave men who fought against him behind the lines, and in the end, stopped the Desert Fox and his panzers in their tracks. Autumn 1942. Hitler's legions have overrun Europe, France has fallen, England stands isolated, Russia reels under the onslaught of 166 Nazi divisions. In North Africa, it's even worse. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and the unstoppable panzers of the Afrika Korps have routed the British Eighth Army and pushed them back all the way to the gates of Cairo. If Egypt falls, so do the Middle East oil fields. The war could be lost right here unless someone can find a way to stop Rommel. Terrain like this was red meat for Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, because in open country like this, a fast mobile force could literally run rings around a slow-moving enemy. By autumn 42, Rommel was one push from Cairo. The British were burning their code books. Mussolini was standing by to enter the city in triumph like a Roman emperor. Rommel had the best guns, the best tanks, the best tactics. Could anything stop him? Did the British have any weapon, however new or unorthodox, that could hold back the Desert Fox in terrain like this? Who was Rommel? As a young infantry officer, he was one of the great heroes of the First World War, the youngest recipient of the Blue Max, Germany's highest decoration for valor. In between the wars, he wrote a book about his experiences called Infanterie greift an, Infantry in the Attack, that became an enormous bestseller and brought him to the attention of Hitler. In the attack on France, he commanded the 7th Panzer Division that broke through at the Ardennes, which was the blow that broke France's back. His reward for this was command of the DAK, the Deutsches Afrika Korps, and Hitler sent him across the Mediterranean to Tunisia with orders to kick the British out of North Africa. Now, Rommel's tactics revolved around a concept called the Schwerpunkt, the critical point. And what this meant was that you didn't attack an enemy across the entire length of his line. You picked one point, concentrated all your force there, broke through, and then tore the enemy up from the rear. That's what Rommel did in Germany during the Blitzkrieg, and it's what he did in Africa. The British had no answer to this. All they could do was fall back, and fall back, and fall back. No one could stop Rommel head on. Let's take a look at a map. Here's the coastline, Mediterranean up here, desert down here. This is Cairo, where the British were. This is Tripoli, where Rommel was striking from. It's a misconception. People seem to think that the tank battles took place in the middle of this vast Sahara Libyan desert. They didn't. But all the action took place in a thin strip along the coast right here, until two young British officers, Ralph Bagnold and David Stirling, came up with a radical idea. Why not get deep through the impassable desert, come around from behind, and strike Rommel from the rear? This was the genesis of the Special Forces and the origin of the SAS and the Long Range Desert Group. These were all volunteer elite units, small and secret, whose mission was raiding and reconnaissance behind enemy lines. Their vehicles were light and fast, stripped down to nothing except the essentials. Their targets were enemy airfields and convoy routes. Their aim was to strike deep, hit hard, and get out before the enemy even knew they were there. These special forces were strictly shoestring operations, minimal budget. This was all they had. 1942 Chevy trucks acquired from a civilian dealership in Cairo, Jeeps gotten from the U.S. on Lend-Lease, Vickers machine guns stripped off of Gloucester Gauntlet fighter planes. They carried all their own fuel, water, rations, and ammunition. To navigate, they used the sun compass. For chow, they had bully beef in tins, hard biscuits, and lots of hot sweet tea. Temperature in the desert could get to be 135 during the day, down to freezing at night. They could count on no help from anybody but themselves and no chance of rescue if they got caught in trouble. Yet in these fragile and actually homemade vehicles, the men of the SAS and the Long Range Desert Group crossed thousands of miles of the worst desert on Earth and raided as much as 500 miles behind enemy lines. The raid was the objective. Then came the hard part, getting away. Out here, there's no cover. If you're caught in the open by enemy fighter planes, you were a sitting duck. The raiders scattered and ran like hell. They camouflaged the vehicles and hid up in any fold in the ground they could find. But casualties mounted. Trucks and men continued to be lost. But by now the British had rallied. Churchill had replaced his old commanders with new ones, Alexander and Montgomery, Monty. The defense of Cairo held at El Alamein. Now it was Rommel's turn to find himself under attack. The Battle of El Alamein was really 3 battles that took place over the course of several months, in which Montgomery and the British 8th Army threw wave after wave against Rommel until they finally broke through. The Axis forces began to fall back to Mersa Matruh, to Sollum, to Tobruk, Derna, Benghazi, El Agheila. They fell back all the way across Libya, past Tripoli, into Tunisia. Now they came to a final defensive stand, a place called the Mareth Line, just south of Tunis, the most heavily fortified, impregnable defensive line on the continent. If the British attacked this head-on, it was going to be a bloodbath. What could they do? Now is the time that the SAS and the Long Range Desert Group really came into their own. They had to find a way around Rommel's defenses. They were in country just like this, totally exposed to air attacks. 9 patrols set out. 5 of them got shot up before they even hit the Tunisian border. But one of them, T1, under Captain Nick Wilder, a New Zealander, found a pass through the mountains. And through this pass 2 months later, the 2nd New Zealand Division ran the left hook around Rommel's defenses that sealed the fate of the Axis forces in North Africa. A couple of months after that, the Germans surrendered in Tunis. Rommel himself was not there. He had been evacuated to Europe a month earlier, sick with jaundice. And now the final chapter in his amazing saga was about to play out. D-Day. The Allies had landed in Europe. In the east, the Russians were pounding the Germans relentlessly, but in Berlin, Hitler remained as entrenched as ever. His orders to his generals were always the same: stand and die. Fight to the last man and the last bullet. Was Rommel involved in the plot to kill Hitler? Not directly, but he did meet with the conspirators and agreed to assume the duties of head of state if the plotters succeeded. Rommel knew the war was lost. His aim was to make peace with the Allies before all of Germany was destroyed. Only he could do it, it was agreed, because he was so respected by the British and the Americans. But the assassination plot failed. Hitler survived. Under questioning, somebody gave up Rommel's name. Not long after, 2 generals appeared at Rommel's home. The woods surrounding it were ringed by armed troopers. The generals met quietly with Rommel in his study. They permitted him a few minutes to say his farewells to his wife. Then they took Rommel in their staff car to a quiet place in the forest. Out of respect for his valor and accomplishments, Rommel had been given a choice: take poison or face the ordeal of a trial before a Nazi court. The 2 generals left Rommel alone in the car. They walked a distance away. They waited several minutes, then returned. Rommel had taken the cyanide. He was buried with full military honors. The cover story was that he had died from wounds sustained in an American air attack. Killing Rommel was an aim that the Allies could never accomplish. It took Hitler and the worst of his own countrymen to stop the heart of Germany's greatest fighting general. Today, almost 65 years later, how many generals can we remember from history's greatest and most devastating war? A few from our own country, perhaps, but how many from the enemy's? If you're like most of us, you can only remember one: Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel is gone, and so is the Long Range Desert Group. Who would have thought that these simple, unarmored vehicles would have proved instrumental in bringing down the greatest desert fighting force in history? After the victory in North Africa, the Long Range Desert Group was reconfigured for partisan fighting in the Balkans, but they were never the same away from the tall sand. As for the SAS, it remains as one of the premier special forces outfits in the world, if not the premier outfit. The spirit of both groups lives on, however, in every Humvee and sandrail, every desert truck and extreme motorsports vehicle. The men who wore the wing dagger of the SAS and the scorpion pin of the Long Range Desert Group and lived up to their mottos: who dares wins, and not by strength, by guile. If you'd like to hear more about this, log on to killingrommel.com or stephenpressfield.com.